Welcome back to the Red Diaries podcast, where in this episode we're going to be talking OSR, why all the mushrooms? And I'm joined in this episode by a person who's played in a number of my OSR games and has munched many a mushroom as various different characters. Johannes Paavola. Thanks for joining me, Johannes.
Hello.
Okay, so first of all, what do we mean by the fact there's a lot of mushrooms in OSR? I was talking to Colin Green from Spike Pit the other day, and we mentioned Winter's Daughter, which is a necrotic gnome. It's an old school compatible adventure set in the Dolmenwood, and we've recently played through this in my Midlands game. And there's a goblin in it who has basically a pouch that's sort of like a pouch of infinite magic mushrooms. And whenever you eat one of these mushrooms, you roll on a random table to see what effect they have on you. And it's a D12 table, and these effects range from things like doubling in size, destroying all your clothing, double melee damage, the last 1d6 turns, up to vomit up a stream of worm and maggots. You're unable to do anything for d6 turns. And that is the pouch of limitless fungi. No matter how many mushrooms are taken from it, it's always full. First time you eat a mushroom each day, it has a random effect. Subsequent mushrooms that day just make you feel a bit sick. Unless noted, all effects are permanent. And I mean, there's even one on this table that says +1 to a random ability score. Like, if you're willing to take the risk, like, you could potentially bump yourself up quite high. And we had a few people sort of chow down on those during the actual adventure. I mean, I believe we had your character doubled in size.
Yeah, destroyed all his stuff.
Yeah, we had Rob, whose character shrank to 8 inches tall. We had Colin's character, his eyes disappeared and they appeared on his hands like something out of Pan's Labyrinth.
Yeah,
and then we had Ian's character who turned entirely transparent for a few hours. So you might think, oh well, that's just one adventure, but I've just got a small selection of OSR books here, all of which feature fungi or mushrooms to some relative degree. Now, there's the Midlands, which has a lot of sort of flora mentioned in it. There's Behind the Walls, which is the adventure I wrote with Glenn Seal for the Midlands, which has a random mushroom drop dice table on the back of it. I've got all the Wormskin zines, which cover the Dolmenwood setting at the moment, and they've got loads of stuff about mushrooms and plants and herbs. A recent one I've got is Fever Swamp by Luke Gearing, Melsonian Arts Council. That's got a table of magic swamp mushrooms in it. And then last but by no means least, there is the Fungi of the Far Realms book, which I believe is again by the Melsonian Arts Council. And that is literally just a book where each page covers a specific type of mushroom, some magic, some not. It gives you their habitat, their appearance, their aroma, and what they taste like, and you get a nice sort of watercolour picture of each one of them. Now, I've been, in an effort to understand why this is such a big thing, I've been looking back at the earliest game I could find that featured this sort of thing. And the earliest one I could find was the game Maelstrom, which is a UK sort of game. It was around about 1983, 1984, I think that came out. And that has it's one of the sort of earlier sort of, I suppose, almost sort of Final Fantasy, fighting fantasy sort of books. It even has a solo adventure in it, but it's sort of snuck an entire RPG system in there. And there's a whole class in there that is a herbalist class, and there is a large appendix. Yeah. There's a large appendix in there, which is literally all about herbs, and that's things like All Heal, Deadly Nightshade, English Galangal, Golden Longwort, stuff like that. I mean, you only get a little sort of one-line write-up, but you get how available they are, what it takes to prep them, how many uses you can get, what the costs are in-game, and how effective it is on a sort of percentage scale. And you get a very brief sort of description of it. So, for instance, we get St. John's wort. We're told that in the summer it's available 80% of the time, takes a week to prepare it, costs 3 shillings and a penny, you get 5 usages out of each dose, and it's effective 55% of the time. And what we're told about it, because like I said, the effects are actually quite sort of general, is that it heals wounds that would otherwise be infected, healing it as a normal rate, and the herb must be applied before the infection throw is made. And one of the benefits of this is you can use them in pretty much any game because the descriptions are quite generic.
Yeah.
So now, obviously, I know that your characters tend to go strong for like the sort of mushrooms when it comes to like the OSR. What is it? What is it about the shroom that appeals to your character? Yeah.
I think. I think obviously, like part of it is me having fun as a player, and having the characters be a vector for that. But at least because the recent years of mushroom munching on my part have been in the Midlands, which is, I think, kind of it leans heavily towards that sort of thing. I feel like that's the feeling I get, and that's the sort of art I think that's in the books as well. It gives me that vibe that I'm in this dank green dark place where, as I've just given you the descriptions, that's where mushrooms grow. So that's what you have. And I think aside from me having a bunch of fun with psychedelic adventures with Dagonite barbarian priests, I think it's very much a part of the setting, really, at least for Midlands here. And I think this goes into I don't entirely want to change the topic here, but
go ahead.
The thought that I had, which just occurred to me a little bit before we started, that one of the reasons that I think, especially OSR stuff, might have more in the vein of herbs and mushrooms and sort of like things that grow, I guess, is that the games and sort of, I guess, the implied settings of these games, they rely less on the sort of like mainline fantasy tropes for healing, because healing is quite scarce in a lot of these OSR games, and then when you get it, you tend to be that sort of like you can bandage after a battle, you get like a pittance of your hit points back. And the sort of, I think the OSR replacement for the magic shop and the healing potion of mainline fantasy is the herbs and the mushrooms, which are given, as we've just discussed, wildly powerful effects sometimes.
Yes.
And they also sort of help with the flavor of the sort of, I think I don't know who invented the term, but the first I heard it used was in Zweihander, the like pathetic chic, which is the sort of like, you don't have the cool like healing potion, instead you're eating these dank mushrooms to like try and like get yourself going again.
I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think part of it's almost a reaction to the not wanting to have loads of sort of lesser magical items. I mean, I've often heard people sort of fairly scornfully talk about sort of high magic campaigns where, you know, like every villager's got like a potion maker,
and
like
a magic shop for whatever reason.
That's it, you know, like everyone's got like a +1 sword in their closet and stuff like that. So I agree with you. I think that part of the use of herbs is to get a bit of that healing and that sort of that flavor of something like a little bit otherworldly, a little bit sort of enchanted, because you can see sort of like how back in the day in the sort of real world, if you went to some like wise person in the village and they were like, I've mixed these leaves into a paste, and it might have just been like a crude like painkiller, but it made you feel a little bit better. That, although system wise in like a game it doesn't do a great deal, you can see how to, like, in a setting where magic's maybe not quite as widely available, that seems like a sort of an acceptable sort of almost commoner's alternative to magic, and it seems to have otherworldly effect if you don't understand like medicine in terms of like modern days of thinking. And a lot
of myth and magic in our real world was just people not understanding what the hell they were doing and not understanding their surroundings either. Because if you have, let's say you have some some gas is leaking out from the ground,
Yeah.
and you start tripping balls. Yeah, that's where the gods are.
Yeah.
You get visions. You get visions, man.
I think as well, sort of talking about sort of potentially sort of like magical crossover. I think mushrooms in and of themselves, like before we had sort of a great knowledge of sort of fauna and flora like we do now, they must have seemed quite odd in amongst themselves, because they don't really seem like a sort of traditional plant. They're obviously not like an animal. I know there's some sort of old sources that sort of viewed them as somewhere like half between a plant and an animal. And let's face it, if you don't understand how spores work, these things just like magically appear on like damp logs. And you've got like, or they appear in like rings, and you can see like how people sort of like, oh, you know, that's where the fairies have been, because this ring of these strange plants just appears one day in like a field. And you don't know that, oh, they've been growing underground from spores, or these spores have drifted on the wind, or animals. They just seem to have appeared from nowhere. It's like I imagine it must have been similar to, you know, they used to think that migrating birds, because they didn't understand migration, they just used to think they just used to disappear and then they'd reappear at certain times of year. Again, a very sort of magical and powerful thing. I think sort of mushrooms and some of these herbs must have seemed very similar, you know, to
and then
sort of person.
With sort of like transferable property of the mushroom then goes to the herbalist. Like the herbalist becomes a wizard because maybe they understand these mushrooms a little bit, or at least they've been experimenting with them. They're being curious for long enough to actually have maybe figured some of this stuff out. And then when there's that one guy in the village who actually like understands about plants a little bit, that's when you get your first magicians and priests.
Well, that's it. I mean, any sort of specialist or sort of closely guarded knowledge tends to be looked upon as something sort of otherworldly or strange from the outside. So if you've got like just what everyone else knows, that like, oh, there's maybe some mushrooms you can eat that are fine, but like the rest of them they don't really know about. But there's one guy who knows like which ones are going to cure your toothache, which ones you can eat, which ones are going to kill you, which ones are going to give you stomachache, which ones are going to affect the milk of your cows if they eat them. That must have seemed like quite a sort of, that specialist knowledge must have seemed like quite a sort of, I suppose, almost again magical sort of thing that like set that person apart from the mainstay of the people in whatever village it was. Yeah,
and the cool thing with that is when you progress to, let's say, like the medieval times, because this is kind of like way back in the day in like my mind's eye, when you have your like little primitive village, and there's that one person who actually like goes out into the forest and tries to understand the plants, and then you move forward like 1,000 years, you get into medieval times, and like knowledge is a little bit more spread out, and there are like the base level of understanding of reality has like been raised, and then you get that to that like interesting part where you have folk remedies, which the folk, as they say, the peasants themselves also use. They don't necessarily go to the wizard or the herbalist or the priest anymore. They actually, and that's where you get into the sort of Midlands thing, where they have a lot of mushrooms around, so that's what the people would use because that's what they have, and that's what they maybe understand the best because of the ubiquitous nature of it. It's just by the like that's how it usually goes with the sort of like natural resources that you have, because obviously like you're exposed to mushrooms a lot, you're gonna like get into that business.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well in terms of like their appearances in OSR games and sort of other games, it sort of ties into that whole sort of slight like puzzle sort of element that was common in sort of earlier like D&D style games, you know, where they tended to be sort of like more sort of puzzles in dungeons. You have to sort of work your way around the challenge and figure out the sort of logic to the puzzle. I think mushrooms, because obviously they're brightly coloured, they can have a range of effect. Even just normal mushrooms, not counting like use sort of weird like magical fantasy ones, can have properties from like causing your organs to fail to like painkillers to being like just good to eat. And a lot of them can look very similar, or they can have very distinctive patterns. So I think sort of trying to identify this sort of thing can sort of tie into that puzzle element that's quite common in a lot of earlier games. Yeah, and I guess that's one more like area of overlap with the magic items that you would have in other games as well. And I think
like OSR magic items too kind of do that puzzle thing where you don't necessarily find the sword that's obviously magical and then cast identify on it. That may never happen. You might be stuck with the quote unquote unidentified magical sword, and you're trying to figure out what happens, because every time you swing there's a wheel of cheese that appears from nowhere. You don't know what that's about.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well it also ties into that. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff in OSR games that tends to come down to like a random chance. So it might be like, oh, you've like, just to take a wandering monster, it might be like, oh, you've got a 1 in 6 chance every few turns of like a wandering monster turning up, or you've got a 2 in 12 chance of this happening. A lot of stuff comes down to just like a fairly arbitrary sort of random dice roll, and certainly for me, that's sort of part of the fun of it, really.
Yeah.
You know, you never know exactly what's going to happen, and we see it certainly with mushrooms and herbs. There's a lot of these things where you can't really identify the effects.
Yeah.
You pop one down, you roll on a random table, something fun happens, and it's not normally in the style of like you eat a mushroom, you roll on this table, dead.
Yeah.
Some of them are inconvenient, but most of them are just like, certainly in the books I've read, are just slightly bizarre. Yeah. Maybe challenging depending on what circumstances you're in, but they add a bit to that sort of chaotic fun.
Yeah. And also, you've reminded me of another thought I had. It's also a vector for a lot of these, especially OSR or like system agnostic products. It's a vector for injecting the weird stuff into your game. And I think that's kind of on brand for OSR in general, or like the sort of like old school games where you tend to have this sort of like gonzo stuff a lot more, and the sort of like wild and weird just nestled into your regular grimdark stuff, maybe, or whatever your setting is, and then suddenly there's spaceships and maybe a mushroom forest and that sort of thing. And I think that's a very important part of the whole like mushroom, the role of the mushroom in OSR games.
Indeed. I think as well, if you sort of look back at sort of written fiction, I mean, in Jules Verne's like Journey to the Center of the Earth, they walk through a forest of like gigantic mushrooms the size of trees, and obviously it goes back even sort of further than that to like very old fairy tales. So I think it is sort of like a link to that sort of older sort of style of fantasy. So like the instant you like walk into a forest and you start seeing some strange mushrooms, it gives you that sort of mental cue where you're like, oh yeah, I'm in like a slightly weird sort of fairy tale-esque environment. So I think it's a handy shortcut to sort of get that idea across. Like obviously if I go, oh, you walk into a coniferous pine forest, that could be a modern day game, it could be a fantasy game, it could be a futuristic game. I mean, why not? But if I sort of say, oh, you walk into a forest, it's misty, there are these strange speckled bright red mushrooms growing everywhere, instantly that's, in my mind, that sort of shifts the genre towards sort of older fantasy or sort of fairy tale myth.
Yeah. Or at least like heavily away from sort of like the standard experience that you would have if you walk into a forest. You're not in Kansas anymore by a long shot, and I suppose that helps set the mood for like if you're like in our Dolmenwood adventures, we started off with like a nautical adventure bit, and then some violence on the beaches as we landed, and then into the forest, and then I think you can, if you go back to the videos, you can pinpoint the exact time when he's like, oh, we are not in a regular place anymore. This is going all kinds of fairy.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously in Dolmenwood you've got like goblins and sort of fairies and strange races and stuff like that. But I think having the actual environment reflecting that, it's just like an extra sort of stream pouring into that, getting that idea across to people that, like you say, you're not in a normal forest, you're in some sort of strange fairy tale environment, and it gives you that sort of mental cue where you're like, oh, I best be a little. I mean, obviously, in OSR games they can be quite deadly, but normally there's some sort of like clues or cues to like let you know what's dangerous, what's sort of going on. And I think mushrooms and these strange herbs, they sort of give you that cue where like, oh, I best be on my guard a little bit, because it's a little bit strange, like odd things might happen.
Yeah, the rules have changed now. Like it's not the pine forest anymore where you could meet, I don't know, like a bear or maybe some bandits. It's not going to be either of those. It's going to be something entirely different.
That's, I mean, when you think about the idea of like, like biomes, like discrete sort of areas that have sort of an overriding terrain or a sort of particular type of geography, I think sort of having these funguses and these strange herbs sort of shifts that biome sort of one step away, often a fairly big step away from the sort of normal world. So that like you walk into a forest and you're like, oh, there's giant mushrooms everywhere and whatever, and then you see like, it almost prepares you for the fact that other strange things are going to happen. So when you see like a unicorn or like a witch or a goblin or something, you're not like, what the fuck's a unicorn doing? We're just walking through the forest. Because you feel like you're certainly in like Dolmenwood, you're in a fairy tale forest. You're not just in a normal forest.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, aside from like, just to like return to like why I fool around with the mushrooms, I really like mushrooms as a person. Like, I enjoy eating them quite a bit.
Yeah.
There's also that. Like, it's a sort of like comfortable area for me, I guess. So it's like, if I guess it's a sort of a reflex as well, because I tend to go for, if there's a mushroom dish, I go seek it out. So I guess just by being me, the sort of like subconscious tendency for me to be like, oh, like I like mushrooms. Like I could do some mushroom stuff with the character, and also because this is probably one of John's OSR games, something weird is gonna happen, and it might be really fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well. I mean, I know yourself and myself have both been out sort of foraging at various points. It is one of those things that sort of adds a bit of an extra level of interest. Like, if you're walking in the woods, don't get me wrong, that's grand. But if you're out there and you're actually like looking amongst stuff and you're like investigating and you're like bringing stuff back, I think obviously that's very enjoyable and interesting in real life. But also in a game, what's more interesting for you guys to go, right, we're going to camp for 8 hours, we're going to eat 3 lots of rations, and then we're going to set off again in the morning. Or to say, like, right, okay, we set up a camp for 8 hours, right, we're going to go foraging in the forest, what do we find? All right, there's these strange mushrooms, like, do we want to take a risk, do we want to eat them? Have any of us got any skills that we can identify them with? Can we maybe, like, contact some of the locals, because they should know a bit more about them? So you can get quite a lot of interest and also potential sort of, like, role-playing encounters from it. Like, say you go to the nearby village and you're like, oh, I've collected these mushrooms, what can you tell me about them? And they're like, oh, you need to go and see the old sage up on the hill. He can tell you all about them. And you can go see like the guy who goes foraging. And it's just a way, I think, of making something which could be fairly sort of bland, effectively just like, oh, we're going to camp, we're going to eat something, instead of just like, oh, it's a sentence of us talking. You cross off some rations, maybe get some hit points back, move on with the rest of the game. It actually makes that part of the game. Now, obviously, you don't want to do that all the time. So if you're trying to get onto the rest of the stuff, you might just be like, yeah, okay, you eat some rations, all right, move on because you want to get onto the rest of the stuff. But especially if you're having like a bit of a lull, or maybe the player, certainly from a GM perspective, maybe the players need a bit of time to sort of mull over some other things that have happened. They can be doing that whilst they're sort of foraging, while they're exploring. So they're expanding their knowledge of the setting. That they're doing like some fun encounters, but also it's not sort of high pressure, so they can still like be thinking about like what the next move's going to be and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like obviously, like you said, you don't want to do the mushroom foraging experience every time you sleep. So I think it's probably going to be quite because we have our game as a context here. So if there's a point in time where there's not a lot going, I will probably, as I do in games that are OSR or not. I will manufacture my own fun.
Yeah.
And in our Middlelands games, well, I happen to play the sort of like uncivilized, sort of like earthy shaman priest individual, and the easy add I can put into any sort of situation is, I go figure out some like herbalism stuff, because that's one of my character's things. I included in the character the idea of having been brought up as a herbalist or a priest, and then if we're setting up camp, everyone's doing their own thing, I will go into the forest, I will find mushrooms, and I will try to identify them, probably fail, and then I will eat them, because that's how I play these games.
Yeah, I mean, likewise for myself, I mean, we've seen a bit of it in your Burning Wheel campaign, which you just started off, but I tend to go for like the rangery or the sort of druidy style characters, because I like that whole interaction with like the natural world. And like you say, even if there's like not much going on, or like you're having a bit of a break or whatever, or you're in like a quiet scene, it's very easy to make your own fun.
Yeah.
If you've got a character who can have a sort of level of interaction with the natural world. Mm-hmm. So even like the last Burning Wheel session, where like the only real time I went foraging was after we got Dennis's character back to the village, and he's like, shove that crossbow. And the healer's like, I need some herbs, and I'm like, okay, right, I'm going to assist you. I'm going to make some rolls. I'm going to go out and gather some herbs. It's a thing to do where otherwise, like my character would have just been stood around watching the herbalist going, fingers crossed.
Yeah, it's like, I'm with you in spirit.
Yeah, so it's a nice way of like keeping yourself occupied if there's like a bit of a lull in the activity. Which, like saying in the last Burning Wheel game, obviously there had to be a lull in the activity because one of the characters was near death and like an NPC healer was working on them. So we couldn't really be like running around as a group. And certainly for myself, if like, I mean, obviously it's only a 2-player game, but if like most of the party's like injured, I'm not one of those sort of people who goes, oh, well, but bad times for you, Sonny. I'm going to be running off and doing all the adventuring shit on my own. I'd rather go, all right, well, let's just like wait. Then we can move past that time and we can all get on with like the adventuring and stuff. But in the meantime, while that's sort of being talked out, it's nice to have like a little bit of a sideline that you can you're still sort of pottering away and doing a few little bits and pieces to help like establish your character. So like, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna watch this herbalist. This could be a useful skill in the future. I'm gonna pick up some tips off them. I'm gonna start sort of gathering the herbs and paying attention to what they're getting. So it gives me like a bit of a tangible benefit in game. But the main benefit to me was just like my character's doing something that I'm enjoying rather than just standing at the sidelines hoping the NPCs are good enough healer, which they weren't. And
like not having, they really tried. The rolls were abysmal in the game. So I think as like a general idea, at least in these sort of fantasy games where you tend to adventure, I guess, with our Middlelands games, OSR games I've played in the past. Fantasy stuff where you don't have a house and you live on the road and you go around doing things. It's a really good idea to invest, like you said, in the natural world in some manner, because then you can have you can produce a lot of content with that. And I am conscious of the fact that there's like a player amusement element in like my whole like mushroom shenanigans, because I like to entertain myself, and hopefully it may be entertaining to some other people as well. And I think it has been that. And also, even if that's one of the like places where this like springs from in me, it turned into there's a whole like other thing with my like mushroom munching shaman dude with alcohol as well. And then I started mixing those with the herbalism stuff, and it turned into this sort of like the parties thing. When we introduced new characters to the party, there was like, and one more thing, like, welcome, you're a part of the group, we're going to do this thing and it's going to be good, we'll take care of you. Also, don't drink anything this guy offers you at all.
Yeah.
It's not going to be good. And then that's a cue for me as a player to, like, in the next scene be like, hey, new guy, do you want a swig?
Yeah, it's like you say, it's a nice sort of act that sort of brings the group together. Like you say, it's a bit of a sort of in-joke between the parties, sort of in character, which is a nice thing, because it's sort of, obviously we know sort of out of character that people are drawn together in the group because they're the group of player characters, but it's nice to have in-character things that sort of tie them together, especially if they've sort of grown almost organically, like the idea of like, oh yeah, we've got a shaman who like always makes these like mad brews with like mushrooms and booze. You might want to steer clear of that. And then inevitably the person will be like, well, I'm going to have some anyway, and that always just some general good fun emerges from that.
Yep, definitely. And I think we had a lot of fun with that sort of thing in that particular game. Before it ended in a tragic manner.
I mean, it's nice in a way that sort of element is sort of carried forward into the current campaign. Again, with your own character, but also other people's characters. So as you've gone more into the Dolmen Wood, that element sort of like re-emerged again, which I think is nice, because it was a big part of the last game. It was something that I certainly know that myself and all the players seem to get a great deal of enjoyment from.
Yeah, we did whole like quests about this stuff. I just now realized, like, we spent sessions on epic, quote unquote, quests to retrieve mythical mushrooms, and we invested a lot of them like in these themes, more than I realized before now. We spent a lot of time on this stuff.
Yeah, I've got to admit, it was only when I sort of listened back to some of it and I looked at some of my notes to sort of like before we did this that I realized precisely how much sort of herbalism and mushrooms has been like involved in all the various like Midlands games and stuff like that we've been running. But yeah, I think as well, if you look at it from a purely sort of mercenary sort of like point of view, if you're playing in like an OSR game, there's really like 3 environments you spend your time in. There's like an urban environment, there's the dungeon, and there's the wilderness. Now, if you're in an urban environment and you need like some medicine or whatever, chances are you can go and buy some of that. However, if you're in the wilderness or you're in a dungeon, you probably aren't going to be able to buy that stuff. However, herbs, plants, particularly mushrooms, can grow in both those environments quite happily. And if you have some skills to be able to identify them, it can give you, let me say, you're not going to be sort of like, oh, I found the magical mushroom of healing, like Shazam, all your hit points are back. But even if it's just a case, certainly in an OSR game where you don't tend to have a massive stack of hit points anyway, if you can maybe like scrounge up a few mushrooms and be like, oh, these are going to restore a few hit points, it gives you just that tiny little edge that can make the difference when you're like stuck miles from an urban settlement.
Yeah, and it's dramatic. It makes for good drama and interesting gameplay if you're trying to drag your ass back into civilization from wherever you were, and you got your ass beat, and you're trying to survive on mushrooms while you're making your way back.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've talked a fair bit about mushrooms. Do you think of anything else that we need to say about mushrooms in the OSR?
I think I guess in like OSR specific context, but for like the sort of like fantasy RPGs that we have, which get a lot of these sort of like general supplements, for example, funded through Kickstarter, there's a lot of them. A lot of these sort of like supplements, like, I don't know the actual product names, but like the Great Book of Herbs or whatever, there's a lot of that stuff out there. For inspiration for this kind of thing. And you've mentioned the what's the mushroom book, the fungi of the far realms?
Fungi of the Far Realms, by Marconian Arts Council.
So there's a lot of good like resources out there for this sort of thing, and people have been making, I think they were called net books, like back in the olden days. They've been making this stuff since forever, like homebrewing, there's a lot of like herbalism homebrew out there
Yeah.
if you want to dig into that sort of thing. And I definitely suggest you do, because people tend to pour a lot of, I suppose, like their love of the weird bits of the games into that sort of thing. So
Yeah, I think as well it's nice because a lot of these supplements in it, like fungi, the far realms, they remind me of like the old sort of works. I think they're called herbals, that like the people used to put together, like the books of like herbs and sort of like trying to write down. And I know there's some from like I've got one on order at the minute, which is like a reproduction, like a 17th century one, which is like, obviously a lot of the sort of beliefs about particular herbs have now been found to be like nonsense or not true to some degree. But I think you can also sort of learn a lot about that time period by what people sort of thought about the stuff that was in their surroundings. And I think if you want to give like a bit of a, I mean, obviously we know that OSR games, they're not like a historical recreation or anything like that of a particular time period. They're mostly in this sort of faux medieval sort of D&D space. But if you want to give a flavour of sort of like a bit of a feeling that, yeah, there's some sort of history to this world, having like old superstitions and old wives' tales and like a bit of sort of woodsman's knowledge and sort of lore of the land.
Yeah,
a very
folklore
effective way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's an easy way of doing it. I mean, you could sit there and you could develop whole sort of complicated sort of folklores and myths and stuff like that. However, if you drop in some like old woman who lives in a village and she's like, oh, you want to be careful if you go out into the woods, there's a devil's cap mushrooms grow out there and they'll turn you blind, and then the devil will get you because you won't be able to see him coming and stuff like that. Although it obviously sounds like an old wives' tale, it immediately sort of gives you that idea of that sort of oldie worldy, sort of slightly superstitious.
Yeah, you don't actually, you never leave the village you were born into.
Yeah.
Like at most you will go to like the big town, maybe, and to the market there to sell your produce or whatever. The ones that you don't, for some reason, use yourself. You know nothing about the surrounding world unless it's these like tales that have been passed down of the wolf man in the forest, and you need to have wolf's bane like across your doorstep and that sort of thing.
That's it. I think a lot of it sort of ties into that idea of like, you know, the hunter-gatherer society sort of way back when, where like you say that there wasn't mass production, that there wasn't things like that. You maybe had like a few animals that you could milk, you maybe had some pigs for meat or whatever. But if you wanted to like supplement your diet with anything, you had to go out, you had to either trade with somebody for something that you had, or you had to go out and like just find that shit out in
get
the woods.
it. Go get.
So I do think it, again, like I say, it's an instance of a useful shortcut to sort of tie your game back to that sort of old, sort of long forgotten past that sort of used to exist.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think people may have gotten the idea that we like mushrooms and we cannot lie.
That's right. And what I'll try and do is I'll put links to some of the OSR books that I've been talking about in the show notes to this, so you can go and check them out if you want. But rather like mushrooms in real life, all you've got to do is like turn over like a damp log and you'll probably find mushrooms everywhere. If you're playing in the OSR, all you got to do is turn over the page in a supplement and chances are there'll be something to do with mushrooms in it. Okay, well, it just remains for me to thank Johannes for joining me, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And that's the end of this episode. If you want to get in touch, you can leave a voicemail message on the Anchor app, or you can drop me an email at reddice@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, and whatever you're playing, have fun. See you soon.